morning and welcome to Whispers in Esther. This is part 1. I will be reading from Esther 1, verses 1 through 22. These events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. At that time, Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of the provinces. The celebration lasted 180 days, a tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. When it was all over, the king gave a banquet for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were in the fortress of Susa. It lasted for 7 days and was held in the courtyard of the palace garden. The courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons to silver rings embedded in marble pillars. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine, reflecting the king's generosity. By edict of the king, no limits were placed on the drinking, for the king had instructed all his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. At the same time, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who had attended him, Mehumam, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abgatha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. Immediately he consulted with his wise advisers, who knew all the Persian laws and customs, for he always asked their advice. The names of these men were Karshena, Shethar, Admantha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, 7 nobles of Persia and Media. They met with the king regularly and held the highest positions in the empire. "What must be done to Queen Vashti?" the king demanded. "What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders?" Properly sent through his eunuchs. Memucan answered the king and his nobles, "Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and anger. So if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the king of Persia, and the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives." The king and his nobles thought this made good sense, so he followed Memucan's counsel. He sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in its own script and language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. Part 1. Disgrace. The book of Esther opens at the citadel in Susa with Xerxes I, who was also known as Ahasuerus in Hebrew, ruler over 127 provinces from India to Cush, which is Egypt. From 486 to 465 BCE, he was the son of Darius I and Atossa, the daughter of King Cyrus. If you will remember, King Cyrus had been moved by God to allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the Lord's temple. See 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra. Decades later, King Xerxes allowed the Jews to rebuild the Lord's temple. He allowed the Jews captured several hundred years earlier to live their normal lives in relative freedom, carrying on their business and their affairs in the new surroundings of Susa. The citadel of Susa was a fortified acropolis with a palace and support buildings on its summit. After a failed military campaign, Xerxes retired to his palace. A powerful, influential, and proud man, he decided to display his vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty for 180 days. That's 6 months. It must have been something to behold. 6 months of boasting in his own accomplishments and possessions. Remember another king, Nebuchadnezzar, who had a similar boast and what God did to refocus his attitude in Daniel 4? At the end of this time, the king held a 7-day banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. What an undertaking this must have been for all the servants and support staff. Food and drink were provided for all those in attendance, and all those in the citadel of Susa, from the least to the greatest. They were invited to partake. No doubt the gardens held abundant food and were draped with sumptuous finery, with hangings of white and blue linen fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. Couches of gold and silver were on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, etc. The wine was served in goblets of gold that were handmade in all different styles, in keeping with the king's liberality. The wine flowed freely. No one was denied more at the king's command. It must have been a boisterous gathering with lots of merriment and abandonment. Queen Vashti was, likewise, entertaining the women at a banquet in the royal palace. No expense was spared to show the guests a good time in either place. What a privilege to be invited to be a part of this world, even for a short time, to peek into the royal world, even for a bit. All the best luxury that could be had was there, and all was going well. Until, after 7 days, the king, full of himself and in high spirits from the wine, sent for his queen, Vashti, to come to his banquet in her royal crown. He wanted to show her off to his men, for she was beautiful, lovely to look at. She was another of his lovely possessions. There was only one problem. Vashti didn't want to go to the garden, where hundreds of men had been drinking for a week. So she refused. This was an extremely daring act for that time, and while I understand and would have definitely felt the same, you don't refuse a king's order in private, let alone in front of those whom he is trying to impress. The king became furious and burned with anger. He had been embarrassed in front of all. The king then consulted his royal advisors, his attorneys, if you will, about how to handle this lawless behavior. Unfortunately, he consulted them in the presence of all the nobles, not in private. Upon hearing of Vashti's impudence and rebellion, the other men feared their wives would likewise rebel upon hearing of the queen's defiance. What to do? Let me interrupt with a note for the modern-day woman. First, it is important to note that our Bible tells it like it is, not just the admirable acts and occurrences. Just because it is related here doesn't mean God approves of an action. This is a glimpse of the culture of their day. Most likely, we become indignant when we hear of the king's order to his wife. We say, Vashti should have been able to say no in such a demand by her husband. How could he expect her to do this? Nowadays, most of us can't relate to a society where women are lesser beings, mere possessions of men. We are so past this mindset. While it is vastly different in 21st century United States, where women are mostly equals of men, sadly there are still cultures in other countries where females do not have the same freedoms. In these cases, they can relate all too well. Anyway, what I wonder is this, and I realize this will not be a popular option with many, but would it have been so wrong for Vashti to do as her husband, the king, commanded? Surely it would have been uncomfortable, but it doesn't appear he asked anything improper. She would be fully clothed, etc. Yes, it would not have been fun to have a bunch of drunk guys ogling her, but presumably she would have been left untouched because she belonged to the king. Could Vashti have appealed to her king and been able to gracefully and with respect change his mind? It's doubtful, but maybe. I'm just wondering. Why is this important to us today? We as wives and women of today have generally less dramatic decisions to make in our daily lives, decisions of whether to submit to our husbands in situations with which we are not comfortable. As Christian women, we have the Lord to whom we can appeal, entrusting the outcome to his hands. We have a personal God who turns the hearts of kings like water. Remember, we are told in Ephesians to respect our husbands, and we see this important thread running throughout the Old and New Testaments. Obviously, this needs to be continually reiterated to remind us strong, opinionated women of God's order for the family, because therein lies his blessing. In Vashti's case, as in our own, God was orchestrating all these events for his own purposes. His plan always has been and always will be for long-term good and his glory. What was the result of this angry husband, anxious friends, and possibly bad counsel? A decree was published in all the territory of Xerxes that all women of all classes were to respect their husbands, from the poorest woman on the street to royal women in the halls of the palace. There was to be no disrespect of husbands permitted, period. Furthermore, Vashti was dequeened, if you will. And so ends the first scene of Esther.